It takes us.
All right, you're up.
Oh, okay. All right. So today I'm going to talk to you about my field work that I've done in the past as a field biologist, environmentalist, conservationist, however you want to look at it. Go ahead. So this is my background. I actually served 4 years in the Navy, and with that I got the GI Bill. And so while I was in the Navy, at the very end, I was kind of like you guys. I was in the community college, and then I transferred to college. It's called Humboldt State University. It's very well known for their natural resources. So if you're into fisheries, forestry, environmental science, botany, ecology, sustainable building, that's a pretty big college to, well, the college itself isn't big, but it's a very important college to go to if you're considering any of that. I have about 8 years of experience as far as ecology, field biology. I did 1 year with what's called aquaculture, and with that, basically I help raise white sea bass and the endangered white abalone. So aquaculture is basically you're raising, it can be plants or animals, but you're doing it in the water essentially. And then I've been a math and science tutor for quite a few years. I worked for different companies, and then when I moved up here, I had my own company. I was a high school teacher, science teacher for a year, and realized I did like teaching, but not necessarily that way of teaching. And a lot had to do with, I just started my own teaching credential program and just started teaching, and it was just way overload for me. So, and then I've been teaching here for 9 or 10 years now, just kind of stumbled across it. It was actually through substitute teaching. And I ended up meeting Neville, and he said he knew my background, that I graduated from Humboldt with biology and zoology, and knowing the how tough of a school it is and what their criteria is all about, he said that he wanted me to teach. I'm like, yeah, right, you know, don't pull my leg. He's, no, I want you to teach. And so one of the first classes I taught, unfortunately for me, was plant science. And I say unfortunately because I have taken botany classes, but unfortunately I did away with most of those study materials. And so then here I am teaching the class, so I had to like scramble for that and everything. So don't throw away your stuff. Anything that's within your major, even though you think, oh, I'll never use this again, yeah, there's always that chance you might. So always save your stuff. All right, go ahead. So went to Oxnard Community College. It's in Ventura County. Got my associate's degree in biology there. Then I transferred to Humboldt State. Got a bachelor's of science in biology with an emphasis in marine biology, and then also zoology. What was really cool, at least back then, is if you planned your courses right, by just taking one extra course would get you that double major. I'm like, well, that's a no-brainer. You know, it's only going to increase my chances of employment opportunities, and it didn't keep me there any longer. So I'm like, so I went ahead and did it. So I'm going to talk to you about research that I've done at a place called Magoo Lagoon, Point Magoo. So it's showing you, oh, I can use the pointer. Sorry, camera. Thank you. Okay, I'm in. So it's in Ventura County, and it's basically, some of you might not have heard of Oxnard or Ventura. A lot of you have heard of Santa Barbara. So it's south of Santa Barbara, but north of LA and Malibu. It's right on the coast, and actually there's a naval station there. Okay, so this is a picture from Point Magoo. Going around this rock, that's Magoo Rock, and then you're heading down towards Malibu. Really nice place. Oh, go ahead. I thought I could advance. I forgot. So what's so special about Point Magoo is, as we've discussed in this class, a lot of wetlands have been destroyed. Okay, and it's actually the largest remaining wetland in Southern California. It's the third largest remaining wetland in the state. So the first largest being San Francisco Bay, and the second largest being Humboldt Bay. Okay, so Point Magoo has 4,500 acres. Of those 4,500, 2,500 are wetlands. So despite how big the base is, most of the base is actually, more than half of the base is wetland, not base per se. And what's really interesting about Point Mugu, because every year the Department of Defense has to come out with like this hit list, potential bases that they're going to close down. And depending on who's in office, they close more bases some years than others, if any at all. And Mugu, unfortunately, more often than not, is on it on a yearly basis. And despite what damage the Navy has done to the wetlands, if the Navy wasn't there, what do you think this would all be? No Department of Defense. Think we're in Ventura County, along the beach. It'd be developed, whether it's condos, harbors, that sort of thing. So it's kind of ironic that the Navy, despite what damage it might do, it does a lot of good for the environment as well, and I'll get into that. But if the Navy wasn't there, there would be a big chance that it would end up getting developed, unless there were conservation groups like Nature Conservancy that could round up enough money to buy the land. Okay? Oh, go ahead. I keep hitting it. So, more than 50% of all wetlands in the U.S. have been destroyed for whatever reason. Habitat destruction, whether it's to fill in those areas, think about like Florida and New Orleans. New Orleans should have never been built on to begin with. It's below sea level. Okay, so a lot of times these wetlands are filled in because, as we talked about on Monday, like with the DDT, because of the mosquitoes, they're not really looked highly upon as far as the ecosystem is concerned. Some people consider them as wastelands. And when we get to California, more than 90%, more than 90% of the wetlands in California are gone. So that's why Mugu, is so special. And with that, 43% of all endangered or threatened species somehow are dependent on the wetlands, whether they just use it as a pit stop when they're migrating, whether they use it as a breeding ground, but somehow, one way or another, 43% of all protected species, some part of their life cycle is related to a wetland. Go ahead. So there's actually a lot of benefits involved in wetlands. People don't realize it. I think, unfortunately, after these series of hurricanes, they really started understanding the importance of it, in which I don't even have it on there, but it might be another slide. Oh, it's right here. Erosion and, go back, sorry. Erosion and flood control, because these act like buffer zones. This is like the middle land between the ocean and the main land. And if you get rid of this wetland, there's nothing to slow down these majorly impacting waves. Okay, so they kind of realize this in Florida. In Indonesia, I think over 90% of the mangroves, which is a type of wetland, they've destroyed. And so they have huge erosion and flooding events now as a result, because there's not that buffer zone. Wetlands act like our kidneys. What's the purpose of our kidneys? Flushing, filtering those toxins, and that's what the wetlands do, because the water comes in, it settles, and it gives it time for the wetlands to kind of filter those toxins, those contaminants out. It recharges our groundwater. Again, that water gets held and it gets time to soak through. Major fisheries industry, okay, whether it's clams, mussels, shrimp, other fish, it's a huge fishing industry. And as we said, it provides habitat for a lot of species. Go ahead. So these are different types of wetlands. The type that I worked at Mugu was fresh and saltwater marshes, but then I also dealt with what are called riparian. So anytime you have a lake, a stream, river, we had little stream that went through. But other ones are swamps. Okay, the thing with swamps is they're actually very poorly drained. There's what's called bogs. These are all East Coast things. We don't have these on the West Coast. Bogs are different than swamps in the sense that they are highly acidic, but with that, they don't have, they have very little oxygen, and not much can live in such a low oxygen content. And there's been a series within National Geographic magazine about these bog people. And so because of this limited oxygen, it really preserves things, okay? And so they started finding what they call these bog people, these people that were apparently actually just dumped into the bog, because they started finding so many. They were like, something doesn't seem right. It wasn't like they just fell into it. And after they started examining, especially the skulls, they all had head trauma. So basically, like if you were caught stealing, whatever the case might be, you took a blow to the head and they just dumped you into the bog. So they've extracted these bog people out of these bogs, and they're actually really well preserved. Fens and prairie potholes, this is more like Montana and the Dakota areas. Okay, they're not acidic. They do receive water, and they're, again, really important for the birds when they're migrating through. And then we have, we'll hopefully see this on our first field trip, I believe, vernal pool. It's one of those areas that you wouldn't even know it's a wetland, especially if you go there in the fall time or the summertime, because the water has evaporated. It's just a small depression, okay? But in the winter, in the springtime, when it rains, it will retain some water. So go ahead. So there's 3 elements that are needed in order to be able to classify a wetland. We call them delineating wetlands to be that. First and foremost is basically the hydrology. You got to have that water component. Doesn't mean necessarily, such as the vernal pool, that you have that water component, 365 days of the year, but you've had to have it for a long enough period of time where it's going to give you these other 2 factors. So that being hydric soils, hydric soil meaning that it shows that there was hydrology, okay? And with that, you're going to have specific types of vegetation. So with that vegetation, there's what's called hydrophytes and halophytes. Hydrophytes are plants that are water loving, okay? Whether it's freshwater loving or saltwater loving, it's just they're able to live in water. Okay. The other type of plants are what are called halophytes. These are salt-loving plants. So you could actually have a hydrohalophyte if you're in a salt marsh. Not only are you in water, but you're in salt water, which makes it even harder to survive in. Okay. So when the Army Corps of Engineers, they're the ones that are responsible for doing the official delineation and determining if this area is a wetland or not. These are the 3 factors that they look at. And what's really cool is I went to, I forgot the name of it now. I always do that. Desert Valley, or not Desert Valley, Death Valley. I was out there, I'm like, oh my gosh, it was so weird because out in the middle of Death Valley, okay, and yet I saw the same type of vegetation as if I was at Point Magoo along the beach. So how does that happen? Well, again, it had the hydrology, and as a result, it had those hydric soils, and that allowed to bring in these type of plants. And it had that salt component, because after the water evaporates, how it concentrates the salt. So things such as what are called like pickleweed and Frankinia, the same exact ones that I was seeing near the beach, I was seeing in the desert, which was really crazy. Go ahead. So we've talked about this, okay, invasive species. Other names that are used interchangeably, but really doesn't mean the same, are exotic, non-native, and introduced. And we talked about the tumbleweed yesterday, and then you guys remember what this was? What was that one? The zebra mussel, okay? And this is one of the things that it does. Okay, if you let your boat sit in the water too long, it's going to be all over your propeller, and then it costs a lot of money to hire someone to clean the bottom of your boat and everything, unless you're going to do it yourself. But it takes a lot of time. And remember the other thing that I mentioned about the zebra mussel? It's clogging up those pipes. Okay, so these are invasive species we have here in the high desert. I dealt with these at the beach. Okay. And we already discussed what's the whole big thing about invasive species. They're outcompeting the natural flora and fauna. We spend not just millions, but honestly billions of dollars to eradicate these invasive species. There's a lot of money that goes into this. And as a result, sometimes we have endangered species, and they're outcompeting these endangered species too, whether it's the habitat, whether the resources. It could be the nutrients, it could be the water, it could be the sun, whatever it is, nesting material. So we had this problem along the beach as well. Go ahead. So ways that invasive species gets here: ballast tanks on ships, sometimes cargo, whether it's on planes or on ships. Like mice, they'll crawl up into the cargo and everything, and they hitch a ride, and before you know it, they've made it across the world. And people, sometimes we intentionally bring them over, and other times we don't. This is an invasive species. It was intentionally brought. Why do you think this was intentionally brought? It's pretty. I gotta admit, it's pretty. Okay, this is one of many different species of what's called ice plant. This particular ice plant, it's really heavy and thick. So it's when you go to try to pull it up, it takes a lot of work to do that, and it's very heavy material. And really the best way to do it is just to pull it by hand. So this one is what's called Carpobrotus. This is the genus name. There's another one, Myoporum, or some people call it Myoporum. This is a lower type of bush. The reason why we didn't want there at Magoo, again, you're in a coastal area, and there really aren't trees until you get into the riparian. So the taller vegetation you have makes it better perching for those raptors. Okay, and the better perching they have, the better seeing they can do as far as taking out other endangered species. And then we had a type of mustard that was invasive as well. So this guy here, this is called the light-footed clapperel. Okay, this is what's called the scientific name. If you see this like really hard name to pronounce, more than likely that is the scientific name. Especially if you see it italicized, it's going to be in Latin. Okay, so this is what's called a scientific name. This is the common name. Common names aren't good to use because, especially when you talk about plants, they can have more than 1, 2, or even 3 common names. And so I could be talking about a certain plant or animal using one common name, and then you could be talking about the same thing, but using a different common name, and we don't even know we're talking about the same thing. But there's only one scientific name for that particular species, so there's no confusion with that. No matter where you go in the world, okay, if someone is an ornithologist, is a bird expert, and you spat off this name, they're going to know what you're talking about. Versus I could call it light-footed clapperel, but if there's another common name, they could call it that, and we don't realize we're even talking about the same thing. So this guy, endangered because of habitat destruction. It's in the wetlands. Over 90% of California wetlands have been destroyed. So he's been on there basically since the Endangered Species Act was put into place. So the reason, like I said, is because of habitat destruction. This was during low tide. And this isn't normal behavior for these guys. They're usually pretty secretive. Usually what they nest in is a rather tall, it's called cordgrass. But at Point Magoo, even though we have wetlands, it's at a slightly higher elevation. And cordgrass doesn't like that higher elevation. It likes lower elevation because then it's flooded with the salt water more. So there wasn't much cordgrass there, and so it decided to use this evil plant that's called juncus, and it has like a needle at the end, and you walk through it and you're just getting poked to death, and you have all these little red dots from you bleeding from it. And so what we would do, we had authorization from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We could do these tapes, these playback calls, and they would kind of like aggravate them. Okay, and that would make them respond. That way we could find the nests. And then once we found where a possible nest was, we would go to it, and then we would actually take data, you know, how many eggs were in that nest. But because we had such a small population size, what happens with your biodiversity? It starts going down. So we're trying to increase that biodiversity. So what we would do is, like I said, go on an egg hunt, essentially. We would go collect those eggs, put them in an incubator. We would go to a different salt marsh. We go up to Lake Carpinteria, about an hour away north of Point Magoo, and they would take eggs from their area, and we would swap them. This is what's called translocating. Okay, that way we're trying to increase that biodiversity, that genetic information. Because if you start dwindling that genetic information, basically you're going to end up having inbreeding and the species is going to end up dying as a result. Go ahead. Oh, go back again, sorry. So this guy, again, this wasn't normal behavior. And one of the things that we would do at Point Magoo, they have an air show there every year. And so we would monitor the effects of the noises from the air show to see if it was affecting the wildlife. And so he was kind of spooked out, and they had different types of airplanes. They have like the old prop ones where they go up and they do the curlicue and they go back down. And then we would have like the Blue Angels where they come and zip by you and everything. They had a stealth fighter. I gotta admit, that was pretty darn cool, seeing the stealth fighter. It was like you really didn't hear it. It was like, wow, that was kind of creepy. By the time you heard it, it was like way after the fact. And so he was getting kind of creeped out, and we had these sound meters, and we were taking these readings. And so he's out and about for long periods of time, okay? All this stuff you're seeing here, these are all snails and crabs and everything, and that's what it forages on. That's what it eats. But it stayed out for long periods of time, and it's vocalizing, okay? Kind of like crickets. The downfall to the crickets making their noises is they do that to try to find a mate, but what's the downfall when you vocalize? You're exposing yourself. And that's exactly what he was doing. He was vocalizing, he was out in the open. Well, nearby we had some telephone poles, and there was a red-tailed hawk, and he took advantage of the situation. Yeah, it was a real bummer day. So that's one of several I had that I'll share with you. So go ahead to the next one. This is called the California least tern, okay? Endangered since 1970. If I had $1 for every time I was pooped on by this bird, I'd be a very rich woman right now. What I learned very quickly, being out in the field, the bird maybe, you know, from beak to tail, about that big. Not all that big, okay? Highly aggressive though. If you go out in other tern colonies where these birds are much bigger, like this long, okay, they have a much bigger beak, and you literally have to wear a hard hat because how big their beak is, they will come and peck you and do some damage. This guy, he was small. He wouldn't do that. What he would do is they would come literally just like this, and at the last minute, they'd zoom right up. And with that zooming right up or zooming right by, I swear they had like a kind of like a bomb button, and I don't know how they regenerate it so quickly, but as they would go by, they would release, and like that, like, oh. So I learned very quickly how to dress accordingly. A wide brim hat, I would wear a shirt, a collared shirt, and I'd put it up, and I'd have it buttoned up, that way it would protect my neck, put my hair in a ponytail because you don't want your hair exposed because it's all in your hair. But I literally had my poop shirt, and it got cleaned once a week because we're out in the field all the time. And that was its way of trying to distract us from either the nest or from the chicks. Go ahead. So this is just another angle of the tern. They're actually really pretty. They're very noisy too. They just you know, you know, kind of annoying. Go ahead. And this is what's called a scrape. This is actually its nest. Not very impressive. It's obvious because I've zoomed in, but it's not all that obvious when you're walking around on the beach until you develop an eye for it, you know, and they're like, oh, okay. But if you're just walking along, you don't know what you're looking for, you know, which I've never done, I must admit, I'm not lying. So we would actually handle the eggs. We had a permit to do so. and I'll get into what we would do with those. So the terns, they did this scrape. This is their nest. They were kind of lazy. Literally what they do is they just take their wing and they kind of do that. It's as if you took your fist and just kind of punched it and it did a little divot. That's all their nest was. Wasn't very impressive. They had anywhere from 1 to 3 eggs. Typically it was 2. Very few times did we ever see 3. And 1 egg was pretty common as well. Go ahead. So it got to the point where you couldn't step on anything other than the sand, because here, as you see, we have mussel shells that washed up. Couldn't step on any vegetation, couldn't step on any sticks, because once they hatch out, they had to go hiding too, because as you know, the beach gets very hot. You know, you're ooh, ow, sort of thing. And so they have to run for cover. Go ahead. And here we have a little baby chick, okay? And no, it didn't come out saying 49 with a prime, okay? I actually wrote that with a fine tip Sharpie, and I specify that because I never stepped on any eggs, but we're dealing with eggs, okay? And I'm dealing with this Sharpie, and I did poke one before, and then I had to kind of confess to the Fish and Wildlife Service. We're allowed to take so many, as we saw in Brian Leatherman's presentation, that whole take thing. So we would have to let them know if we were responsible for the take, or maybe we thought something else was. There wasn't always where the eggs hatched out. And so we tried to determine if it was successful hatch or not. If not, what was the, you know, who ate the egg essentially, because you would end up seeing like pockets of dried yolk. So sometimes we had, in one weekend, we had a coyote. He must have been the fattest coyote afterwards. And we think there was probably 2 coyotes, but they took out 40% of our population over one weekend. Okay, so this isn't a 9 to 5 job, Monday through Friday. A lot of times you're up at the crack of dawn at Oh Dark Stupid, or you're at, you know, you're staying up late because coyotes, you know, they're being nocturnal and everything. So you might be up at 11 o'clock, you might be up at 3 in the morning trying to track these predators. So what we did when we first started monitoring is every nest we came across, we marked. So this was nest number 49 and egg number 1. In all honesty, we didn't know which egg was laid first. We just arbitrarily, okay, I picked this one up first, you're number 1. And you're number 2. Well, obviously that one was actually laid before this one, okay? And we had our notebooks out there, and every time we would go out, we would be taking these notes. If it hatched out, if it didn't, if we saw maybe raven tracks, if we saw, let's see what else, possum tracks, if there was rat tracks, if there was the coyote tracks. I mean, it was like, sometimes there was just feral dogs running through. They didn't necessarily eat the eggs, but they would stomp on the nests. You know, you go running in this middle of the colony, all the birds flush up, and the dogs think it's playtime, okay? And so they end up crushing the nests. So we kept track. At the very first season that we started this, because we had so few nests, I don't know if I think it was a couple of things. It was just, we were new at doing this, so maybe we didn't find all the nests. That beach wasn't protected as well as it was in the past or future years. And so we started getting so good at finding the eggs, and the birds started liking the beach so much. We had like over 500 nests. So we weren't able to mark every single nest at that point. Go ahead. This is what's called a fledgling. Basically, it's a bird that's learning to fly. Okay, these guys, they have to know how to fly, not necessarily immediately, because the parents come and they feed them the little minnows. Okay, that's not the case on this other bird that I'm going to show you. They had to learn how to fend for themselves right away. So this little guy looks a lot different. I mean, of course, they're going to be a little bit smaller at that point, but they're sort of this brownish color. And we do the fledgling census in the evening. And we would do it from behind the dunes, and then we would do it from the ocean front too. just so we could, because what you can see from the dunes, you can't necessarily see down at the waterfront, and vice versa. Go ahead. So this is actually a low tide. You can see the tidal creek here, but during high tide, this would have been all covered. Again, this is like all mussels and snails. You can see this green material here. A little bit's okay, but what would happen by the end of the summertime is, depending on what part of the tidal creek we're talking about, where the tide wasn't able to flush it in and out all that well, it would totally be matted over. This is algae called Intramorpha. The common name is called tubeweed, because if you were to do a cross section of it, it's like a hollow tube, like a straw. So yesterday we talked about that whole, well, what happens here is eutrophication. Basically, you get this algal mat, and it takes up all the oxygen content out of the water column. So whatever was living in the water basically suffocates and dies. The other problem to that is, if we have it totally covered, okay, the tern goes out either to the ocean or within the tidal creeks to get the little minnows for the baby birds. But if it's covered with that algae, you can't even see the fish, even if they were alive. So the reason that we had excess amount of this particular algae was because Point Mugu is surrounded by ag fields, particularly strawberries and sod farms. So then we kind of tried to do some outreach with the farmers, not telling them how to do their job, okay? But what was happening is they would fertilize their fields, and they would overwater their fields, and that fertilizer ended up into this estuary here. And then so you have this fertilizer, and you have the warmer water, and the algae just goes crazy. Okay, go ahead. So this guy, these are all pictures I took myself too. This one I'm especially proud of. It was just one of those rare moments. I had my camera out. I was kind of like on a National Geographic safari type thing, you know. And I was maybe here to the desk, and she was all inquisitive, just as inquisitive about me as I was with her. And she came right up to the nest. I'm like having a total geek fest. I'm like, oh my God, it was right there, you know. And I happen to have my zoom lens and everything on. And so she came right up to the nest. And this one is called the Western Snowy Plover. I like this bird better because they didn't poop on us. Okay, that's a big plus right there. The way that they would try to deter us from the chicks or the nest is they would do what's called the broken wing display. So if the nest was right here and I'm coming towards it, she would start doing this sort of thing and start, I know the camera's not going to get it, but start moving away. Okay, all of you just watched me go that way in hopes that I forgot where that nest is. So that was the whole broken wing display. And at times we would know we were close to a nest or some chicks because they would start freaking out, flying back and forth. They had a certain call. We're like, okay, where is it at? Just tell me. I'm going to find it. So just get it over with, you know. She came up and, go ahead. She actually started incubating the eggs. So again, I'm like totally, you know, all excited about this and whatnot. I know this was a female because the shoulder band, there's an eye patch behind, and then there on the crown of the head will be a definite black marking, and that will be the male. Female, it's not as obvious. A lot of times it's very drab. But as the season progresses, they come out of their breeding plumage, and it becomes a lot harder to tell the males from the females. So what we would do is, as we're doing our census and we're walking along, we couldn't determine if it was male or female, and so we're just putting a check in the box as far as it was an adult. The terns, you can't determine male or female just by looking at its plumage. Basically, you got to kind of get personal with it. You would have to catch it and look at its private area to determine if it's a male or female. So some birds, like you guys know, like mallards, the males are very showy, okay? So some birds you can tell by the breeding plumage, and others don't display that. Go to the next one. So what we did at the beginning, because we didn't have that many nests, we actually floated the eggs, okay? There was some guy that somehow figured out that depending on when you float the eggs, you had, and you measured it in millimeters, no, centimeters, let me think about this. I think it was centimeters. How much of the egg surface was exposed to the air, you would measure the diameter, and this guy developed a graph, and you could say, okay, well, there's 19 millimeters exposed. You go on the graph, and it would tell you exactly how many days before it was to hatch out. Like, man, that's pretty cool stuff. So we used it to our advantage. It's like we knew, based off of how we measured it, it was going to hatch out in X amount of days, and then we would go back and verify if it was a successful hatch or if it got preyed upon. Okay, so we had to be rather quick about this because we tried to have we had warm water, but we would do this in the morning time, not in the afternoon, because typically the wind breeze picks up in the afternoon time. And if the mother is not on the nest, the eggs are getting cooled down or they're getting heated up. If there's a strong breeze, then the sand's going to cover the eggs up and they can't find the eggs. Okay, so by putting the egg in the water, you're naturally cooling it down. So we had to be very quick about it, and then we would dry it off and we'd put it back and we'd walk away. We would take, one of the invasive species we had was giant reed, arundo. It's basically like bamboo. Sticks everywhere. We take the stick and we would smooth out our footprints. That way, because we thought possibly the ravens or even the coyotes would use that to guide them to the nest. Go ahead. I think one more time. There you go. So this is a plover nest. You're a plover lover. That's what my boss always stressed to me because I kept saying plover, and you're a plover lover. I'm like, okay. So they typically had 3 eggs, very different than the terns because they have these black scroll marks, whereas the terns kind of had more of these grayish blobs. Okay, and they, being the plovers, they like doing it in these little V areas where the sticks come together. They took a lot more time to do their nest as well. These are all broken seashells that they brought from the beach one by one. Okay, so that's pretty labor intensive. The downfall to it is it being shell lined in white on a somewhat brown beach sand kind of made it stand out and made it easier to find. Okay, go ahead. Look at that one. Again, you can see it because I zoomed in on it, but if you're just any Joe Schmo walking, you might have not. There it is right there. There's our footprints, and so we would cover them up. So again, you couldn't step on any twigs. Yeah.
We had a lot of those back home on the Owens Lake when I was doing construction.
Oh, really?
You had to like do a whole separate training just for plover.
Yeah.
If you stepped on one, you're fired.
Oh, really? Yeah. It really is. I mean, we're talking about endangered species here. They really should have had a biologist out there finding it.
They had plenty of biologists.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and they made you aware. They probably didn't put necessarily a flag there because...
They're like a 10-foot radius.
Oh, did they?
They made sure you knew about it. They had to flag it off. They had to do a caution tape around.
Yeah. Because, you know, what would happen is the GPS that we used was highly accurate, even back then. We're talking back in the year 2000. And, you know, we all have GPS capabilities with our smartphones, but we're talking about when it wasn't capable for everyone to have. And it was so accurate, it was up to 1 centimeter. It's like, what? Why do we need it to be that accurate? Because we literally would have, and it happened with the terns, not the plovers, but there would be another nest right there. Okay, and so if you only have 3-foot accuracy, and if you did the radius of that, you could have encompassed 5 or 6 other nests, but because you're only that accurate, it's only going to look like there was 1 nest when there was really 5 or 6. So we are accurate up to the centimeter with that. Go ahead. So here we have the little chicks. They're hatched out. Okay, they're relatively newly hatched out because you see how it looks different here. This is their puffy feathers, but this is still wet from coming out of the shell. And what was really cool, sometimes we even literally saw them hatching out in front of our eyes. You could see them. It's called peeping out. And so they start pecking out of the shell, and then you start seeing their little beak, and then the shell starts splitting apart. It was like way cute. So they look like little cotton balls on two sticks, on two toothpicks. They're so stinking cute. Go ahead. So there I was. That's how you have to start the story, right? So we had this intern one time, and he went to Humboldt, and we were starting to noticing a relative of the plover. They're called a killdeer, and we started finding scrapes along the runway, which is a potential nest. We're like, oh, this isn't good. Birds and airplanes do not mix well. There's what's called BASH, bird airstrike hazard. Okay, and we've heard about it where some planes will take in a bird and, So we're trying to prevent that because we're at a naval air station. They're practicing, basically what they're doing is they were practicing simulating landing on an aircraft carrier, okay, before they actually made it to the aircraft carrier. So we started seeing potential scrapes out here. So we would go out there twice a day. Now, as we talked yesterday, you can destroy a potential nest as long as what? There's no eggs in it. Once there's eggs, no matter what type of bird we're talking about, you gotta let nature ride its course. So we would go out destroying the nest, trying to encourage them to nest elsewhere. So Nathan was out, and he's like, Lynn, he goes, there's a nest on the runway. I'm like, and we always played pranks on each other. And you're out in the sun for 6 to 8 hours, you get kind of loopy, that sort of thing. And so we'd always play jokes on one there, and he goes, yeah, there's a nest on the runway. And we're like, yeah, right. He goes, no, I'm not playing around. I'm serious. I'm like, really? He's, yeah. So where do you think the nest is along the runway? You can't say it. You heard it before, Derek. Don't say it. No, I know. And you can't say it, Warren, because you heard it. Any guesses instead of those two? Keep your eye on the yellow box. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. There you go. So somewhere there is a plover nest. You see it yet? No? Keep your eye on that right there. Go ahead, click again. Click again. And there we go. Crazy, right? Go back one if you would. These are, I know they don't look in the best condition. These are tie downs. Again, this is to simulate that the jets are landing on this aircraft carrier, very limited length. They have to nail it in an exact spot, okay? And these are the tie downs because they're out in the middle of the ocean. You get rocked back and forth. You're just not going to have the jet like that. You got to make sure it's secure down so it doesn't go bouncing everywhere or off the aircraft carrier. So they weren't using the runway that much for a couple of weeks. They weren't doing their operations. And as a result, the plover is like, hey, no one else is out here. This is kind of like prime real estate. No one's bugging me. I think I'll lay some eggs here. Go to the next one. So, and that didn't set well with the CEO of the base, the company, the commanding officer. So my lovely boss that he made me go talk to the commanding officer. I'm all scared and everything. Like, I feel like I'm back in the Navy. I had to talk to him. And so I show him this picture, and he was not a happy camper, and he thinks we're literally trying to shut them down. So we had to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're like, you know what? This is really cool. We're not going to shut you down. Let's just write it out and see what happens. It's kind of your guys' fault that you weren't keeping the planes going and it was good habitat for the birds, but let's just see what happens. We did float the nest, or the eggs. We had a projected date. We went out to check on it. It didn't seem like it was preyed on, but the likelihood of the chicks surviving was pretty slim because unlike the terns, the mom and dad brought in those little minnows, okay, until they were able to fly. These guys, if you guys have been on the beach and like there's that kelp that washes up and it attracts those annoying flies, those kelp flies, well, that's one of several things that the plovers eat, okay? in order to get to the beach, not only did it have to go along the runway, it had to go through the marsh, it had to cross a road without getting hit, had to go over the dunes, and then make it to the beach. Because these are the little chicks. They can't fly. They had to do all that walking. So more than likely, unfortunately, these guys didn't survive. Go ahead. So there I was. I was in this area, it's called the salt pan. During extreme high tides, it would flood out, and then throughout the summer, the salt water evaporated and left behind is salt, okay? But flies were attracted to that, and plovers started getting interested in those areas because the beach started getting pretty crowded with all these terns and all these other plovers, again, over 500 nests. And so it decided, oh, well, the salt pan area is good, which was okay, as long as it wasn't getting flooded out. And I noticed this mother plover, okay? And then I'm looking at it, I'm like, wow, that's really weird. It had more than 2 legs. Like, how can that? In fact, I end up counting, and I end up counting a total of 8 legs. I know, right? And I'm like, okay, maybe I'm seeing things. So I look through the scope again. Nope, there's 8 legs. Well, there was a seagull. All gulls, we call him George. I don't know why. All sea lions, we call him Fred. That's just what we did. So George was pretty interested in this area of the salt pan. And then I realized those other 6 legs were little chicks underneath the mom. And they came running out, and they would go foraging, and they would go hunkering under mom again. Like, okay, well, George saw all this happening too. So he decided to make his swoop, and all hell broke loose. And, you know, there's chicks going everywhere. The mom's getting all freaked out. George is going everywhere. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So then I'm trying to count how many legs are still there. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm like, crap. And I count again. And I'm like, there was 8. Now I only have 6 legs. So then I'm watching, keeping track of George, because there was other Georges as well. So I wanted to make sure I was still honing in on this one. And I started seeing him kind of doing that gulping thing that they do. I'm like, no. So I called our predator manager guy. He would do the trapping of the animals to protect our endangered ones. And I go, I have this gull out here. I'm pretty sure it took one of the plover chicks. So he came out with his gun. He shot him. He opened up the body cavity, and there was the baby plover chick. So that was another bummed out day. So, you know, but that was Matt's job, was to, you know, if he felt there was a bird that was acting too conspicuous, you know, you take him out, you could trap him, release him elsewhere. But sometimes he would kill depending on what it was. So there was only 1 chick that was taken, luckily, instead of the other 2, but it was still a pretty bummed out day. Go ahead. And there he is. So we talked about this guy. I think there's one more. Privanka, thank you. The California brown pelican, as you know, is no longer on the endangered species list because we outlawed that chemical, the DDT. My mornings were like way awesome, and my afternoons couldn't ask to end the day any better. We kind of like fought who was going to get to work first, because the first thing we would do every morning, we would go to the estuary, which is where this creek, fresh body of water meets salt body of water, and that area is called the estuary, and it's brackish water. It's not fully salt water, it's not fully fresh water. Okay, and so the pelicans would hang out in those in that area. So our mornings were doing a pelican census, like cool. We would do a sea lion census or harbor seal census. So it was a really nice way to start the morning. These are adults. The way I know that is, and it's in breeding plumage because of that red pouch. Okay. The juveniles, they will be about, the year-old juveniles will be about the same size, but they won't be as colorful. They're just kind of this drab brown. Go ahead. So as we said, this was a success story. These guys were not just downlisted from being endangered to threatened, but they were delisted. They were totally taken off the endangered species list. okay? And we already talked about this as far as the eggshell thinning. The DDT didn't allow the calcium carbonate to bind to form the good hardy shells, all right? So an endangered plant or threatened plant that we monitored was called salt marsh bird's beak. You see all this purple here? Okay, that's obviously not normal for a plant color, so that kind of should raise a flag. There's something special about this plant if it's purple. Okay, it being purple, it's not able to photosynthesize as well as it normally would be able to. That's what green plants do. So because it's not getting all the nutrients it normally would, it's a hemiparasitic. What's hemi mean? Partially, half. So it wasn't a full-on parasite like mistletoe, okay? It only partially got its nutrients from surrounding plants. Go ahead. So this is what it looks like up close. Somehow someone thought that looked like a bird's beak. Don't know how they thought that, but they did. We're in a salt marsh, and so honestly, these plants, even though they're halophytes and they're hydrophytes, they don't like the salt either. They've just learned how to adapt, to deal with the salt. So what this particular plant does, it excretes the salt through its skin. Okay, so you can kind of see some salt crystals here. Whereas this one, the common name is called pickleweed. Someone again, they thought it looked like little pickles stacked on top of one another. And you know how this time of year we see the leaves start changing color, and that literally the marsh will change colors too. What will happen is the salt is extracted to the tip, and then the tips end up falling off, and that's how it gets rid of the salt. So this guy, endangered since 1978. Again, 90% of all wetlands have been destroyed in California, so habitat loss for this one. Go ahead. So we would do GPS global positioning system. This is where you literally take in the data. Okay, the GIS, the geographic information systems, is where you do the maps, to do the visual representation. So there's two different color flags here, and basically, I think the green flags were the perimeter of the plant, how it grew the previous year, and that way we know where to check. And then the purple is where it was growing this year. And so we could look at the map just for what happened this year, or we can compare it year after year as far as its growth pattern. The seed dispersal was dependent on rainfall and the tide, because it would flush the seeds out. So sometimes the perimeter would be farther out because there was a higher tide, or maybe there was more rain that came that year that distributed further. Doesn't mean it was necessarily more dense within the perimeter. We're just concerned how far out it went for the most part. But then we would do these line transects, very backbreaking work, and basically we would do figure out the biodiversity, what plants were associated with that salt marsh bird's beak. And what numbers, what percentages of maybe the salt marsh bird's beak, obviously, but also maybe the pickleweed, any other plants we saw associated. We tried to figure out what was the percent composition related to it. Go ahead. So we did that with that invasive species I told you about, the giant reed. And this was just showing us one area, because basically we would have to go to battle and tell either the Fish or Wildlife Service or the Navy, this is why we want to eradicate, and this is how much area, this is how much it's going to cost. Okay, so it gives you a good visual representation, just how big the population is. So we went with the GPS unit, and again, just went along the perimeter. And that way they had an idea how much of the beach was being encompassed by this invasive species. Go ahead. This is the nest, okay? The least turn nest, the ones that do the dive bombing. And so you can see the layout of the beach. The ocean was here. The dunes were back here. Look at that guy. Talk about being the black sheep, right? He was totally out by himself. But you could see where it was more concentrated than where it started dispersing out. So you can, look at that. So you can see why we needed up to a centimeter of accuracy. Otherwise, that group there would have been considered like just one mother load of a nest, which we know isn't the case. Go ahead. So not an endangered species or threatened or protected, but just really cool. Okay, so, and this was only in one area of the marsh. This was the area of the marsh that was along the runway. And so this is within the family of orb weavers. And the way I know that was because of this type of pattern on the web. Go ahead. There's another one. I know it looks like it's really big. I mean, they were pretty darn big, but it's not like obviously that big. As far as like the leg, it was still with the legs, it was about that big. I mean, the body wasn't that big, but it was kind of hard not to notice it. I mean, this was a really good indicator. Okay, and we would try to, you know, notice them and go around the web. We didn't want to destroy it because they have their part within the ecosystem as well. Go ahead. You guys are all creeped out, aren't you? Like, ah. So what do I have here? A badger. Yeah, look at those claws. They're like that, you know. It's like Wolverine, right? Yeah. So this was a species of concern. We weren't trying to trap this guy. Our predator manager guy, he had this trap for coyotes. Again, coyotes really like the eggs, and this was in that clapper habitat. And so we ended up catching him. Stunk really, really bad. He wasn't killed. He was relocated to a different area because of being a species of concern. But it was just like a really cool day to come across that guy. Go ahead. So there he is again. He was really big and fat. So again, the way we would start off our mornings or end the day was with this seal count. Because it is a marine mammal, doesn't necessarily mean it is endangered or threatened, but just the mere fact that it is a marine mammal, that means it's protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Okay? So do you guys know if I'm looking at a harbor seal or sea lion, and why? Why?
Because of the ear.
Yeah, because of those external ear flaps. Okay? These guys, the sea lions, they can sit upright, and if you ever like go to the circus or SeaWorld, they'll have them be bouncing the ball on their nose, or they can walk across the floor rather easily. Okay, go ahead. This one is not a happy camper. What happened, this was during the El Nino year, which is very typical for the mammals then to get very sick as a result. And so he was severely dehydrated. He came up the tidal creek and made it through all these tidal gates, and he ended up all the way up by the air hangar. It's like, dude, how did you do that? So we had this big dog crate. We got him in, and so we had to have cardboard, one person over here, and I'm here, and basically, you know, we just kind of back him up into it. And so then we went down to, I think it was San Pedro, and they have a rehab center. They put a tag on their flipper in case they come back and they're sick again. We can monitor them. But they made sure that he was doing okay, and then they just release him out into the wild. Go ahead. So these are the harbor seals. They're smaller. They're a mottled color. These guys can't sit upright like the sea lions, and the way they come up on the beach is basically they kind of have to thrust themselves and they kind of do the slinky action. Okay, but they used Point Mugu as an area of their pupping. So we would see little babies, and they, you know, they'd be feeding them and everything, which was really cool.
So do they drink water from the wetlands, or how do they hydrate themselves? Do they drink salt water?
Their bodies are able to handle the salt. Yeah. So they didn't really, for the most part, I think where they drank was out in the open ocean, not so much in the estuary. They would do hunting within the estuary itself because of the calmer waters for the baby seals, but for the most part, they just swam out into the main ocean. Go ahead. So you see all this? That's bad, very bad. That's that giant arundo, okay? That giant reed, basically that bamboo-looking type of material, totally covering potential plover habitat. Now, in all honesty, this wasn't the best area for plovers because on extreme high tides, the tide, the waves would wash over that part of that particular beach. So the beach continued all the way down here, and there was what's called the CBC firing range. So in order for us, PCH ran here. So instead of like walking across and having to go through the estuary and all that, we walked this end of the beach and we did the census of the plover. But we didn't get too close where we would flush these guys, but they weren't always there either. It depended if it was high tide, low tide, depending on the layout of the beach and whatnot. But we would have to get permission to go out because they're doing literally live fire. So they would cease fire, they would wait for us to come out, we would call them, okay, we're clear, and then they would do their firing range again. So we were basically the only ones ever on the beach. We're like, wait, cool. And so lots of different animals hanging out. We have the sea lions and harbor seals. We've got the pelicans. These are called cormorants. And that giant reed that I was showing you was of this area. So it doesn't allow for nesting habitat. The birds, none of the birds use it for anything. The only thing it was really good for is a good walking stick. Or if you're a surfer, they would take a bunch of this and they kind of make a teepee, and then they'd hang their wetsuits to dry. But other than that, it'll choke out any system, whether it's within we have it up here in the Mojave River, it'll choke out the river. And it's a really big problem actually in San Diego and Ventura County rivers. Go ahead. So, if this is something that actually interests you, and even if it doesn't, kind of my take-home message is that pick a career that actually interests you. There's nothing worse than doing not just a job, but a career that you really don't like and you have to go to that every single day. Sometimes it's a really cool job, but the people you have to work with necessarily aren't really all that cool, but you just got to bite the bullet on that one. Keep an open mind, because there could be opportunities that keep resurfacing and you're like, oh no, this is the only thing I'm ever going to do. Me being a teacher, an instructor, was not part of the game plan for me. It really wasn't. But these different opportunities started coming up. I'm like, well, maybe I should take a hint here. And then especially when I got into the high school teaching, not to toot my own whistle, but I literally got hired without a teaching credential at that point. I had an emergency one. And I got hired over credentialed teachers. And it's one thing how you look on paper, but then after you actually meet someone, she goes, with what life experience you have, you can bring that into the classroom and you just have this personality. I know you know how to interact with those kids. Again, those other people, they had teacher credentials, and we've all had those one teachers like, oh my gosh, really? It's very boring and you didn't do as well in that subject material as a result. Okay, so just keep an open mind. If these certain opportunities keep opening itself up to you, then maybe you should consider that. No matter what your career is going to be, you really need to do volunteering and get an internship, because that's going to open their eyes. And hey, if you're willing to dedicate that many hours without pay and do that high quality of work, imagine what you're going to do once you have that dollar bill in front of your face. Okay, and that's a way of them kind of scoping you out and training you, getting you ready for the job after you've graduated. Constantly take classes, seminars, workshops within your field. Stay relevant. Okay, I'm considering doing this myself in the spring, going on to the master's degree. I kind of went stagnant. Yeah, I do a lot of reading off the internet, but it's not the same as taking a class. Or even, I do attend workshops and seminars. That way you keep connected with that circle, okay? Which leads to the networking. That's really what it is, okay? I've had it to where I was considered number one qualified for that job. I passed the test, blah, blah, blah. And then they end up hiring the number 3 person. We'll come to find out that number 3 person, his uncle was the dean of the department. Well, okay, why did I even go through all of that and got my hopes up and everything? So it's about networking. Don't burn those bridges while you're doing that networking. Okay, some careers are more closely knit than others. Word of mouth gets around pretty darn fast, and people aren't going to want to work with you and hire you on. And especially if you're in the field that I was in, I really regret not taking more pictures and videos. Not so much a problem nowadays. We all have that phone that has that capability, but that wasn't the case back then. So you had to lug around that heavy camera along with your GPS, along with this, and there's only so many hands you have. So I regret not taking more pictures or videos to share that information when I do these presentations. Plus, you can use that in your portfolio. You can put it in your resume. Okay? All right. So quiz, today's Tuesday, so it closed already. Yeah? Wow, there's nothing to do right now. You can go ahead and stop the recording. There's nothing to do, is there? There's no quiz.